Have you ever wanted to try hand sewing something, but you didn't know where to start? In this series, we'll show you what needle to use, what stitches are best for what, how to use a thimble, everything you need to know to hand sew. This is Hand Sewing 101. One of the things that makes people paranoid about sewing shears is how are you going to do the seams? Because, God, you don't want to run that through a serger, do you? I wouldn't run anything through a serger. Poor fabric. Why would you want to go through a serger? Ugh. But, you know, sheer fabrics tend to be very ravelly, so you have to do something that seam, or else when you wash it, it'll be a battle of attrition. Your seams will just unravel and unravel and unravel until someday you won't have a seam anymore. And that would be horrible after all your hard work. So I'm going to show you how to do a French seam. Now, a French seam is really, you do a seam and then you do a seam. So you're basically sewing every seam twice. So what I'm going to do is, and because you're sewing, you sew the seam on the outside with the right sides of the fabric together, and then you flip it and you sew it on the wrong side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pretend these are the right sides. This is opposite of how you would normally sew. The outside of my fabric is facing me. Normally, it's the inside of my fabric. So this is the outside of my fabric, and I'm just going to sew a running stitch, fine running stitch. Oh, damn, I hate when I need to get enough in there that I can get my finger behind the needle so it doesn't fall out. Remember what we're talking about, how your needle falls out of your shears? Well, there you go. That was my needle falling out of my shears. All right, so I'm just doing a regular running stitch, an equal distance from the edge, and make it a small distance. You want it to be a small distance, and I'll show you why. Matter of fact, whatever your seam allowance is, sew half of your seam allowance from the edge at this point, because I'll show you why in a minute. So do your running stitch along there, and then you get to the end of where you want your seam to be. Pull your thread through, straighten your thread. Don't ever let it be bunched up like that. Should have been straightening it as I go. Stitch back opposite a couple stitches to secure your thread. And cut. So there's your running stitch. Put a knot in your thread again. So there's your running stitch. Now remember, this is the outside of your fabric. So now we're going to flip it around so there's an inside of your fabric. We're going to finish the seam. Now, if you want to, before you do this, you could neaten up this edge, and you'll know why in a minute. So I'm just going to show you what I mean by neatening it up. See all those furry bits? I'm going to take those off with my embroidery scissors. I'll show you why. So just cut them off so they're not sticking up and that everything is nice and even. Then I flip it inside out. And you could give it a press at this point, but with sheer fabrics, you can see right through them. So you don't really have to press them. I would press it flat like that normally if this wasn't sheer, or if I wanted to take the time, but I don't feel like heating up the iron for it. All right, so now you've got it, and you've got it in your hand, so that your stitch that you just sewed is on the inside, and it's all the way up at the top of your work. Now you're going to take your thread again, and you're going to insert it right under, let me put this up close to the camera so you can really see it. Please autofocus. Right under where that seam allowance is. You see, I'm right under it. Can you see through there? Oh, I'm gonna move up a bit. See how I'm sewing just under that edge. And then I'm going to get to a part where I didn't cut. And now you see why I wanted to cut. I'm just going to go through it and show how horrible it looks when you don't neaten it first. Right? I pull my thread through. And I'm not going to do a knot. I'm not going to sew backwards because I have a really, really big thread, really, really big needle, and I'm just going to cut it off because this is for demonstration purposes. So that's what a French seam looks like on the inside of the fabric, and what a French seam looks like on the outside of the fabric is a regular seam. Gosh, you make my hands shake. So it's just a regular seam. Looks like any other running stitch seam. But you see on the inside of the fabric, which you can see through this because it's a sheer, all of your nasty little threads are encapsulated in that seam. So when you wash this and it tries to unravel, well, it can't because it's sewn twice. So it's really, really useful. This again is the inside. The only thing you have to do two things when you're doing French seams, and I'll show them to you in another video. But the first thing you have to do is always, always remember that you're sewing the right sides, the wrong sides together first. So the right sides are on the outside, the correct sides. The fabric that you want to see is on the outside when you do your first stitch, which usually it's never. It's on the inside. So put the right fabric outside when you do your first stitch, or you'll be like me and sew a French seam wrong 11 times and have to rip it out. And I did that as a professional because I was tired and I wasn't paying attention. So I did it wrong 11 times. 11 times. And really, there's a right way and a wrong way. So it's not like there are 11 different ways to do it. There are 2 ways to do it. One's right, one's wrong. I did it 11 ways wrong. So there you have your French seam. The other thing that you have to remember is if you are sewing something like a 90-degree angle, like on a gusset, you need to, when you sew that first seam, you need to allow your seam allowance in the corners so that you don't end up all cramped up when you get to the corners with 2 seams meeting each other at right angles. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, just ignore me. I will talk about it in another video. But for right now, there's your French seam. Terrific, terrific way to finish your seams with ravelly or sheer fabric.